tossing grenades at Windmills Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I am Tom Ricks, and this is the 8th in an 11-part series called 11 Fixes for a Broken Everything. The theme of this is changes we can make within our current system without rebooting the Constitution. Although the next series I'll be doing, as I've said in previous episodes, will be called The 7 Sins of Silicon Valley, and the problems and challenges created by the tech culture of Silicon Valley. This episode is going to be on wealth inequity. There have been some seminal works on this which can discuss the problem infinitely better than I can. Most of my knowledge that I consider authoritative on the subject has come from two of the original sources and a Nobel Prize-winning work called Capitalism in the 21st Century by Thomas Piketty. I always pronounce that name wrong, but you can Google it. As well as the original Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. All three of these documents are incredibly useful, and I'm actually not going to be providing a summary of them, but they have greatly informed my discussion on this. Instead, I'm going to begin introducing my thoughts on this subject by some absolute understanding of human nature. I speak, of course, let's first refer to the title of this episode, which when I refer to Milo Mindbender in chains, in the work Catch-22, there is a character by the name of Milo Mindbender, who is a parody of a human being, but every one of us has known somebody like this, who has an intuitive understanding of the needs and wants of other human beings and trades one thing for another to create wealth. And ultimately, this is the cornerstone of how capitalism works, and ultimately why it works better than communism or socialism in terms of the sheer amount of wealth it creates. And the trickle-down effects of capitalism are very real. I think as flawed as he is, Rumsfeld did have an excellent, Donald Rumsfeld at one point made a speech about North Korea, in which he said all you have to do to know the difference between North Korea and South Korea is to look at a satellite image of the number of lights in North Korea versus South Korea. But it's much more complicated than that. Specifically speaking, the Milo Mindbender effect is something that no society on the history of mankind has ever been able to avoid. In old tribal days, before the history of man, I think we can all agree that there was probably one guy in every band who was able to trade things among other people to get what he wants. Certainly that kind of thing happens in families. Not every family has it, but there are many families, especially extended families, that involve trading milk, my milk for your peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and sometimes it's limited to that. But when people get a real taste for it, trying to make something illegal like that does not exist. There's a reason that pretty much every society on Earth has black markets. In Soviet Russia, they actually tried to literally outlaw profit, and the result of that was the Russian mafia, which eventually grew to literally take over the country and become part of the government to create a kleptocracy. The fact of the matter is that there's a certain subset of our population which is good at trading. We also tried, for example, in the 1920s to outlaw alcohol, and all that did was empower organized crime until we realized, let's harness this and make it useful. Right now, there is an effort to legalize cannabis because if a certain significant portion of the population desires something and someone is willing to provide that service, they're going to get it no matter what consequences you try and set up with the government to try and make it happen. It is folly to try and regulate human behavior solely through the threat of force. Now, there are things that can be done to change and shape culture, and I'll be discussing that in another podcast in the series. I've already discussed some of it. For example, when I talked about regulating psychopaths and their ability to have power, that's a very simple thing you can do in a society, and it is something that we have both the technology and, if we have the will, to enforce. However, basically, trying to stop the tide is not going to work. So, but at the same time, the consequences for ignoring the outrageous effects of Milo Mindbender compound the larger you ignore it, the longer you ignore it. Like I said, I'm not going to summarize the Communist Manifesto or The Wealth of Nations, but I will summarize capitalism in the 21st century, and the summary conclusion, the thesis, as you were, is that with an astonishingly well-researched amount of math, it is the inevitable conclusion of capitalism in the 21st century that if unchecked, capitalism realizes ever-increasing amounts of stratification. And what stratification is the difference between the people at the top and the people in the middle and at the bottom. And anybody who is well-read and not a conservative understands that the 1% or even the 1% of the 1% has an obscene amount of wealth. And our entire society is geared around making them richer and richer and richer. We're not talking about just simple financial artifacts that they have access to that we don't, like stocks or, beyond a 401k or bonds at industrial levels. At this point, we're talking about complex financial engines that it takes graduate level mathematicians to work out and ascertain, more than even the things you've probably heard about, in terms of blind hedge funds or automated stock trading with AIs that basically exploit the market. For everything that you've heard of, it is reasonable to assume that there are other obscure things besides tax breaks, tax shelters, blind trusts, etc., etc. And every time that anyone attempts to close these things, they're usually about 10 years too late. The richer you are, the more resources you have to have experts help you to get more and more obscenely wealthy. And while there are some social movements to theoretically check this, for example, an effort by Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and a few billionaires to leave the bulk of their fortune to charity, the fact is that these foundations often have questionable motives that ultimately sometimes seem to benefit the wealth of their founders in ways that we don't necessarily need to approve of. Either way, let's just simply talk about the simple fairness of it all. While it is true that you cannot legislate away profit, there are societies that are much healthier, specifically the Scandinavian countries or Canada, or virtually any country in Europe, that does not have the problems that are unique to the United States, where certain basic human rights are ignored or systemically induce poverty. So, as I said, this series is about practical, scalable solutions rather than ranting about problems that many people already know about. And to me, the most obvious solution to this is to put a chain around Milo's neck. Now, the income tax, which was created by the 19th Amendment and was a huge debate of the 19th century, did a pretty good job of this, and that was the intention, is to basically find a way to basically tax the income of these people. But the fact of the matter is that as we all know, through what was initially benevolent intentions of attempting to motivate people to do things like donate to charity or their church, or to have good corporate practices like the appropriate benefits to their employees, such as health insurance, one after the other, Congress each session, due to political pressure or just rampant corruption, has created more and more tax exemptions, some of which are, quite frankly, almost impossible to get rid of, and others, which seem to be impossible to get rid of, are gotten rid of only to be replaced by something worse that only benefits the rich. The fact is that there is a simple way to fix this problem, and there are other smarter people that have proposed solutions different than mine. For example, I really am a fan of Warren's 2% tax on the wealthy, or Bernie Sanders' plan to create a micro tax on transactions on stocks to stabilize the market. But the truth is that I don't think either of these solutions gets to the root of the problem, and that is that the Milos of the world are always going to be better than the rest of us at both creating wealth, understanding the numbers behind wealth, and exploiting any and all loopholes that might exist, no matter what you think you are doing. There's a reason that Jack Kennedy was put in charge of enforcement of prohibition for a while by FDR, because he had been a rum runner, and it was understood that to catch a rum runner, you need a rum runner. And in certain cases, smart leaders, presidents or governors, have put people like venture capitalists in charge of enforcing these kind of things, but the end result is that very often they are worse than the problem, because while they do enforce some things, they create backdoors for themselves and their friends, and on and on and on it goes. My solution is really simple. It is to create an unalterable formula that sets the upper tax rate of income tax, and you can throw in wealth on top of that, but basically the highest tax bracket must be tied to growth for the median 90% at GNP. And by that I mean real GNP. So let me break that number down for those folks who aren't necessarily financially educated. Real GNP basically means gross national product, or in other words, so for example, if we take all the money in the United States that's generated by anybody and any income, it's X number of dollars, right? Let's just say $1 trillion, even though it's not, but $1 trillion is an easy number to understand, right? So if I basically say that all of the economy of the United States was $1 trillion, then that would be the GNP, or gross national product. Now, real GNP per capita basically means that if you adjust for inflation, and I'm John Smith, an average citizen who has the median salary, let's say $20,000, which is not an accurate number, but I'm deliberately sidestepping numbers because I don't want to get in a quagmire for semantics Democrats. The fact is that real growth per capita basically says that if, for example, in the year 2020, I have 5% inflation, or in other words, it costs me $1 to buy bread in 2019, and it costs me $1.05 to buy bread in 2020, then that means that the dollar of 2019 is worth a little bit more than the dollar of 2020. And so when you say real GNP per capita, what you're essentially saying is the amount of money held by an average citizen, adjusted for inflation, needs to be linked to how much you tax the upper class. If Joe Smith and average Mary are richer at the end of a given year, then the upper tax rate goes down. If they are poorer at the end of the year, that tax rate goes up. And if you eliminate any limit on that, which is to say that basically the richer the middle class is, the poorer the richer are, then all of that energy that right now they are spending on lobbying Congress and creating a lie factory and manipulating the black market creates a specific mechanism by which the rich and powerful are motivated to enrich the rest of us. Now, as far as the bottom 10%, I believe that direct government intervention is always going to be required in any society that we have that I'm aware of at this time. I think that the bulk of us need to be empowered through what libertarians love to call the tyranny of the majority, which is to say that there are more of us than there are of them. And if every human being, no matter intelligence, race, creed, color, religion, etc., has some intrinsic value simply for being a human being, then the amount of wealth that these people obtain is almost never justified. Simply by dint of the fact that there's another book I want to point out, which is called Outliers, which you've probably heard me quote before, but the most useful part of that book is that it shatters the illusion of meritocracy. While there are meritocratic aspects of our system that are true, the fact of the matter is that most of the people who you see in a rags to riches story had some hidden advantage in terms of timing or culture or training that was unique to them. And that is especially true of every single one of the Dark Lords of Silicon Valley. But like I said, that's a different series. So the point is that all of these people that supposedly create jobs and create wealth are only able to do so through a combination of government infrastructure that is provided by the rest of us, or through the exploitation or outright theft of wealth of other people. I, for one, do not know of a single example of a billionaire that does not involve the individual exploiting other people or behaving in a manner that is absolutely ethically unacceptable. So when you understand that there is no such thing as a moral right to wealth, there is a moral right to property. Absolutely, I should be able to control and own my own home. Any society that does not allow my home or the means with which I create my livelihood in a system to be controlled by me is almost always going to be a tyranny, and tyranny is never acceptable. But the libertarian babble that, like so much else they speak of, is not a binary thing, but it's a scale. And it's shades of gray. And the fact is that what is true at a small scale, i.e. my home or my car or my livelihood, is definitely not extended to my mansion and a yacht and, being able to own 6 helicopters so that I can take a different helicopter to work every week. The fact of the matter is that it is utterly and morally obscene that these people have the wealth that they do. So it is not only intelligently the prerogative of society to check the stratification of that wealth, but it is also the moral thing to do. The reason I think that chaining growth of real GNP per capita for the median 90% of society to the highest tax bracket is important is because unlike income tax and unlike wealth tax, it will create a motivation for these people to actually help the rest of us. Whereas anything else is simply going to create an obstacle that they try and create a way around. If they understand that it is the absolute expectation of society that these two are linked and that there is nothing that they can do about it and that there are no exceptions for that tax rate, then they will spend all of the energy right now that they spend on lobbying Congress to create special tax breaks for their particular industry to finding ways to generate wealth for the rest of us. There is no other solution, in my opinion. A 2% wealth tax is great, but trust me, they'll find ways to erode it in 20 years. Even if you get the money out of politics, you can't get the influence of money out of society. Even if you try and regulate speech, which, by the way, is an accident waiting to happen. And yes, I know you've heard me call for certain regulations on speech, but not political speech. The fact of the matter is that you need to stop lying, but you can't stop people who are trying to tell the truth, even if it's their own subjective truth. Otherwise, you're going to create a tyranny that is not beneficial to anybody but a small handful of people in society.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, available in many markets, including at Amazon.com. Copyright
2019.
Red Anvil Amalgamated, LLC.
To fight the forces of evil!